Hey guys, I'm out here today near Signal Knob Peak, Virginia, and I've got with me this 1993 Russian Federation military issue backpack. We're going to be talking today about the Battle of Grozny in the Chechen War. We're going to look at the tactics used by both sides, and we're going to discuss why the powerful Russian Federation was defeated by a group of Chechen militia. We're also going to field test this pack, and we're going to hopefully get a perspective on what it was like to be a Russian conscript in Grozny in 1994. So stay tuned. In order to understand the pack, we of course have to understand the history behind it. We have to understand the Battle of Grozny in the Chechen War. So let's take a look at what it was like at a tactical and strategic level to be the Russian Federation in the Battle of Grozny. In order to understand the Russian experience at the Battle of Grozny, we're going to use the U.S. Army's operations order. These 5 paragraphs cover every essential consideration that a commander needs to know in order to plan a military operation. I used it for my daily patrols in Afghanistan, and it's used all the way up to strategic level briefings by general officers. Today, we're going to use the op ord to help us understand the Battle of Grozny from the Russian perspective. Let's get started. The situation in Grozny in 1994 was, to say the least, complicated. Then the Russian Federation was only a few years old, and the economic downturn that plagued the Soviet Union had only deepened during the first years of the administration of Russian President Boris Yeltsin. The promise of the post-Soviet world had given way to the realpolitik of parliamentary democracy, and President Yeltsin had promised the electorate that he would resolve the issue of the Russian Federation's breakaway provinces. Nearly 90 ethnic and linguistic minorities reside in Russia, but by then all but one had agreed to some form of federalism under Moscow. The only holdout was the restive and resentful Chechnya under the leadership of strongman Dzhokhar Dudayev. In order to preserve the Federation and to demonstrate to the world and the Russian electorate that the Russian Federation still preserved its status as a world-class military power, Yeltsin ordered the Russian military to bring the restive province under control. Central to the Russian plan was to be the seizure of Grozny, the region's capital. This was a city of 300,000 people, a mix of both Federation-loyal ethnic Russians and Dudayev-loyal Chechens. Though in fact, Chechenya's two true power brokers are tribal leaders. The Russian military's perception of the Chechens was poor. The Russians felt they likely numbered a few thousand militiamen, with little training, low morale, and improvised or no equipment and arms. The reality could not have been more different. In fact, the Chechen morale was high, and they were committed to the fight. They were eager to strike a blow at Russia, who 50 years prior had ejected the Chechens from their homeland as part of a Stalinist-era relocation policy. Also, Chechens are predominantly Muslim, whereas the Russians are largely Orthodox Christian, and this added a religious dimension to the conflict. The fighters were also made up of local police forces, many of whom had served in Afghanistan in the Soviet campaign. This gave them both tactical and small arms experience, as well as an intimate knowledge of guerrilla warfare. Finally, while the Chechens lacked the heavy artillery and aircraft of the Russian forces, they were equipped with numerous small arms looted from decommissioned Soviet military depots. These included, crucially, RPG-7 and RPG-18 anti-tank weapons. As you can see here, the Chechen order of battle was under a central command which subdivided their units into 3 or possibly 4 main battle groups. However, below the main battle group, Chechens operated as small 75-man companies of light infantry. Each company, which I've broken down on the left, was subdivided into 3 20 to 25-man platoons. Each platoon had 1 or more armor killer teams armed with RPGs, a machine gun team, as well as light infantry. Some platoons would also have snipers attached. In total, the Russians fielded 5,000 soldiers and approximately 10 tanks, as shown by this small tank company here. Russian forces, in contrast to the Chechens, were largely conscripts who had received minimal training. The Russian attack on Chechnya was divided into 4 task forces that were cobbled together of units from different regions and different commands. They were Task Force North, West, Northeast, and East, supported by indirect fire assets as well as aircraft. Also assigned to the Grozny operation was a company of Spetsnaz. Those are special forces teams. In total, about 38,000 soldiers supported the Russian mission in Chechnya. However, during the Battle of Grozny, only approximately 6,000 entered the city to drive out the Chechen rebels. Each of these task forces units were badly understaffed, with most manned only to around 50% of their authorized strength. The Russians felt that the enemy's most likely course of action was to flee the city in the face of 4 advancing armored and mechanized infantry columns, that Russians expected to seize the capital without a fight. Of course, what they failed to plan for was the Chechens' most dangerous course of action, and that was if the Chechens chose to dig in and resist the Russian forces. This most dangerous course of action is precisely what they did. The Russian military's mission, when reformatted to comply with the U.S. Army Opboard format, reads something like this. No later than D plus 24 hours, Russian forces seize key city infrastructure and the presidential palace in Grozny, Chechnya, in order to re-establish Russian Federation control over the region. In reality, however, the Russian military gave virtually no guidance to its troops. Few, if any, soldiers or officers understood the missions or why they were there and what they were about to do. Some soldiers later complained that their guidance had been limited to, quote, protecting roads, unquote, and most of the conscripts appeared to have little idea that they were going to be facing any armed resistance at all. One battalion commander reported, quote, the only order was to go forward, without explanations as to what we should do, where we should go, and who we should capture, unquote. Even some elite Spetsnaz troops were reported to have wandered aimlessly around the city, unsure of their larger mission or purpose. The Russian plan was simply a 4-pronged attack into the city with armored columns. Each task force was to drive into Grozny, seizing key terrain, and eventually converge on the presidential palace. As you can see, the key terrain included a hospital, a large public square, an oil refinery, and a rail yard. The problems with the execution, however, began almost immediately. Russian forces' indirect and fire and close air support failed to dislodge any of the Chechens. In fact, it was rumored that Chechen forces, knowing the Russians were going to invade, had instructed civilians, at least Chechen civilians, to leave the city. And so the only ones that remained were Russian nationals, who were, of course, most likely to be loyal to Moscow. As the columns all arrived and began to stage, Russian commanders asked for another 2 weeks to prepare for combat. However, political considerations forced President Yeltsin to order the army into the city before commanders felt they were ready. As the 4 columns advanced, the Chechens, relying on intelligence provided to them by a handful of local civilian scouts, successfully was able to fight a delaying action against all 4 of the columns. Generally, the Chechens exploited the Russians' poor training and lack of personnel. As we can see in this diagram, the Chechen forces would allocate their armor killer teams in buildings, usually on rooftops or basements, extremely close to where the city streets where they expected the Russian armored columns to begin their advance. As Russian armored columns crept through the city, Chechen armor killer teams would engage and destroy the lead vehicle and then the trail vehicle, effectively trapping these armored vehicles inside the city street. Chechens knew that Russian tanks, T-72s, their turrets were unable to raise or lower sufficiently to engage close targets that were either at a high elevation, such as on a building's roof, or in the building's basement. As such, Chechen forces always tried to hug and get as close as possible to those Russian armored columns to prevent the tanks from becoming a deciding factor in the battle. Once the armored column was frozen in place, Chechen machine gun teams would open up on any dismounted infantry that attempted to secure the tanks. However, because the Russian conscripts were so poorly trained, often they remained in their armored vehicles and were easily picked off one by one by the Chechen RPG forces. As a result of this action, Russian losses were staggering. One entire brigade was trapped and entirely wiped out, losing 20 of their 26 tanks, 102 of their 120 BMPs, as well as suffering nearly 1,000 KIA, including the brigade's commanding officer. Even the elite Russian Spetsnaz troops were captured after being surrounded in the city's south. It's almost impossible to understate how ill-prepared the Russian forces were for this fight. But to give a big picture perspective, let's take an example of one typical Russian motorized rifle brigade. Its authorized strength is 3,000 soldiers. However, like most brigades in the Russian military at this time, it was only manned to about 50% strength. Now, of those 50%, half were frighteningly untrained conscripts. For example, conscripted tank crews, often had never fired a live round from a tank at all, and didn't appear to know how to. Other troops had never participated in a unit exercise above the company level, and many conscripts did not even have the paltry 5 hours of urban combat training Russian training manuals recommended. Now, of this hodgepodge unit, the terrible logistics led to poor sanitary conditions and a lack of medical care. This meant that in some units, a large portion were out with preventable illnesses that included hepatitis, cholera, dysentery. As you can see, when the Russian political leadership felt they were sending in a 3,000 soldier brigade, but in fact, the number was less than 1,000 soldiers. It's also difficult to understand how poorly structured the Russian leadership and command structure was. The level of corruption and careerism had turned the generals into yes-men or incentivized high-ranking officers to hoard or sell badly needed supplies. The tactical plan to enter the city was simply unfeasible given the logistical state of the forces. The four maneuver elements, already undermanned, were split up and couldn't support one another. If one came into contact, they'd be unable to maneuver and support the other. On the particular period, the December of 1993 and early 1994, the cloud cover was so thick and so cold that Russian fixed-wing and rotary-wing assets weren't even able to offer many meaningful fire support to the troops on the ground. Tactical leadership failed by allowing these armored columns to approach without their accompanying infantry, and when they did, the infantry was so poorly trained they simply remained in their BMPs. And often the officers, lacking worthwhile maps, got lost in the city and fell into Chechen traps or were separated from their unit and killed. Even individual Russian soldiers failed, as they frequently got drunk and were unable to get even basic rations. It was routine for Russian soldiers at checkpoints to accept bribes of vodka or bread to allow through any number of contraband, unauthorized persons. It even at one point became so bad that the New York Times reported that Russian conscript soldiers were frequently suffering from outbreaks of lice and that were visible in their hair as the reporters were attempting to interview them. Also, the Russian troops, far from answering to a single Ministry of Defense, were from 3 different ministries, including the MOD, Russian Internal Affairs, and the FSB. This meant that there was literally no ability to cross-communicate. The only link among these 3 agencies was Boris Yeltsin himself. It's clear that from the start, the Russians set this operation up to be a total disaster. Their inability to supply their troops, the inability to effectively come up with a plan, the unwillingness of the political leadership to give their commanders the authority and time and resources they needed to succeed ensured that the Russians were almost certain to be defeated at Grozny. Alright, so I'm about an hour into this hike, and I was really fully prepared to hate this backpack, but for all the design flaws that it has, it's really very comfortable, especially for a soft-sided pack with no internal or external frame. Once you get the straps adjusted just how you want them, it actually feels great. I'm very surprised given the Russian reputation for absolutely awful gear. You can see conditions on the trail. It's super dry, super rocky, but with the backpack strapped down, it hasn't really shifted too much, which can be an issue on terrain like this. You can see getting any piece of gear in this backpack is kind of a pain in the ass. Now here I am just to get at this bedroll. I've got to undo these top straps, bottom straps. It's just a huge pain. I mean, imagine doing this under fire. Okay guys, so it rained last night, and I just want to point out some of the absurdity that I was talking about with this pack. Alright, so as you can see, I gotta get my tent mounted to these bottom straps. The only problem is, the bottom straps are also the shoulder straps. So in order to get at this tent, I need to undo the actual shoulder straps on my rucksack, right? Then loosen or undo the second clasp in order to detach or reattach my tent. In addition, it's raining out, and this bag is untreated canvas, so it is going to get wet on this hike. You can see, to get this on here, I gotta mount it first to here, cinch it down, take it out, alright, with these non-quick release clasps, feed this canvas strap very carefully in before reattaching it to my ruck shoulder straps. So you can see this is a process. Yeah, ta-da! Alright, so I've got about 3 hours of hiking on this backpack. We're up here at Signal Knob Peak, Virginia. Overall, I gotta say I was impressed. I know Russia has a reputation for having absolutely terrible military-issued gear, but this backpack was extremely comfortable, especially for something with no external or internal frame at all. These straps really didn't dig into my shoulders as much as I was expecting them to. You can see the pack itself, I use the exterior almost as much as I use the interior space with the bedroll, tent, rain gear, and water all strapped to the outside. I did have some issues with the pack. First, that these external pouches are secured only with Velcro. So if you get caught on something or you trip and fall, there's a good chance these pockets are going to open up and your stuff's going to be all over the trail. Also, these clasps are not quick release, so you have to actually unlace the canvas straps to get at the main pouch, or if you want to undo, say your bedroll or your tent, and that can be a real pain. Now, if you were a Russian conscript in the Battle of Grozny in 1994 with a pack like this, that's urban combat where the pace is just frantic, and minutes and seconds are the difference between life and death. So if you need a piece of gear, let's say a specific mortar round or a smoke grenade or a signal flare, well, now to get that, you have to undo 2 canvas straps, undo the shoelace and just to get at the main pocket. You have to throw your stuff everywhere to find it. And then once you do find it, you have to repack everything and restrap everything down. And you're talking about 5 minutes, which is a lifetime when you're under fire. So overall, I think this shows that the Russian Federation at the time was still thinking with that old Soviet warfare mentality. That idea that their troops were going to march into combat, they were going to deploy, they were going to engage in combat, and then they were going to redeploy. And that they're going to have time to go through all these steps. But by 1993, even the U.S. forces had figured out that they needed to put a lot of their gear on the outside. Rucks had the 3, sometimes even 4 pouches. They had quick release straps on everything. And so because they understood that, the combat of the future was going to be fast-paced, urban, and it was going to require its soldiers to get at their gear fast and in a hurry. So all in all, I would give this pack 3 bottles of Stoli vodka out of 5, but the terrible late Russian Stoli, not the good stuff. So we talked today about the Battle of Grozny, the tactics and strategies used by both sides. We also field tested the pack and took it out overnight. But what we haven't yet done is talked about what it was like to be a conscript in the Battle of Grozny. For that, we turn to journalist Arkady Babchenko's memoir of his time as a conscript in the First Chechen War, One Soldier's War. Babchenko describes a Russian military in almost complete disarray. He reports that he is routinely beaten by other conscripts, not because in an effort to toughen him up or instill discipline, but for extortion. He describes one older conscript who beats him savagely and then demands 600,000 rubles, over a year's pay, in 2 weeks, or else Babchenko will be beaten again. And so, Babchenko, like many conscripts in his account, begins to loot the supplies from his base. He steals engine parts from vehicles, weapons and ammunition, and sells them to the Chechens in an effort to raise the money to avoid the beatings. Once he raises the money, the other conscripts then use it to buy vodka and heroin, which they, of course, consume in a raging party sometime later. Babchenko also describes arriving in Chechnya woefully undertrained. He reports that he's only fired his weapon 2 times prior to shooting it at the enemy, and that's common among all the conscripts. The truth is that Babchenko reports that most of the army feels unbelievably let down and demoralized. And when we read historical accounts and we say, oh, this army's morale was low, sometimes we impose ourselves on it. And we think of times where we might have been tired or hungry or felt like we couldn't continue. And that's certainly a part of morale. But the bigger driver of morale is really a willingness to fight for the army, for the cause that we are fighting for. And in Russia, it's worth noting that this was a different Russian state than what many of these boys had grown up in. They grew up under the Soviet Union, which was seen as the communist opposition to the capitalist world. But now they were fighting for something called the Russian Federation, with different territory, a different system of government, and even a different economy. So it seems as though it was very difficult for any of these soldiers to turn around and fight for an idea or for a nation that they had never seen before, especially one that was as badly governed as early post-Soviet Russia. Babchenko describes his frustration at being a soldier in Chechnya like this. He says, quote, "Shorn-headed boys, sometimes morose, sometimes laughing, beaten up in our barracks with broken jaws and ruptured lungs. We were herded into this war and killed by the hundred. We didn't even know how to shoot. We couldn't kill anyone. We didn't know how. All that we were capable of was crying and die we did." He goes on to say, "We wanted to live. Get that into your heads, you fat, smug generals who sent us off to this slaughter. We were betrayed by everyone, and we died in a manner befitting real cannon fodder, silently and unfairly." You know, it's easy to think of the First Chechen War as a sort of footnote in history, a small conflict of no particular note. But it's important to remember that for the Russians, when they were defeated here, it was a national humiliation. That, combined with the failing economy, destroyed the general public's trust in Boris Yeltsin and in parliamentary democracy generally. The electorate wanted a strong, decisive leader capable of restoring Russia to its prior glory. And they found it in Boris Yeltsin's successor, Vladimir Putin, who for the past 20 years has ruled Russia largely as an autocrat. And so, while the soldiers at the Battle of Grozny may not have realized it, in fact, what they were fighting for was the survival of Russian democracy. But ultimately, the politicians, the officers, and to a lesser extent the soldiers themselves, they decided that it wasn't worth fighting for. And Russia paid the price.